My hidden agenda in writing this paper is to examine how architects explain or justify their architecture to a larger audience, especially through published manifestos. My working hypothesis is that there are three main constituent elements in such manifestos. First, an underdetermined functional argument that supports a formal objective. Second, some sort of disclaimer that may well contradict the primary argument. And third, some reference to an external authority in order to lend some credence, cachet, or street cred to what otherwise might seem specious or weak. In the case of Louis Sullivan, who I believe created the template for these kinds of didactic instruments, the underdetermined argument is that a tripartite division of the tall office building is the logical functional basis for its form. The disclaimer clarifies that most other utilitarian considerations are not of interest, and the desire for cachet or street cred comes about through implicit references to both German philosophers and American transcendentalists. Juan Pablo Banta, examining critical appraisals of Sullivan's Carson, Peary, and Scott building, shows that even seemingly objective features of the facade are subject to critical disagreement. Where Nicholas Pevsner, for example, sees an almost complete absence of ornament, Bruno Zevi argues that ornament was not a superimposed screen, but an element of poetry intimately integrated into the poetics of the structure. Both Siegfried Gideon and Walter Behrendt see horizontality in the facade, while James Marston Fitch and Kurt Rowland see a more neutral grid. It is the stylistic orientation of the critic that provides the pretext out of which a functional objective is alleged to emerge from the form. Function, for both critics and architects, is most often a code word that allows entry into the subjective sphere of taste. Sullivan's famous aphorism, that form ever follows function, first appears in the tall office building Artistically Considered, published in 1896. Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, and so on, form ever follows function, and this is the law. Numerous critics have challenged this proposition by referencing the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin, who showed conclusively that, at least with living species, it is more accurate to state that function follows or co-evolves with form. In other words, that incremental deviations in form arising in the offspring of any given species create the preconditions for functional adaptations or maladaptations in which the fittest such adaptations survive. The idea that natural forms evolve to reflect their function, that one precedes the other as in a design problem, is a teleological argument known as the Lamarckian fallacy. Using Sullivan's sweeping eagle as an example, the implicit idea is that there is something like an eagle that needs to fly, and therefore a form somehow is created or evolves to perfectly enable that purpose. Yet it is clear that birds did not evolve in order to fly. In fact, the opposite is true. Birds can fly because a series of evolutionary changes having nothing to do with an intention to fly turned out to enable flying. Sullivan's extrapolation of this Lamarckian model of species evolution to the relationship between architectural form and function provided perceptive critics with an easy target. But it is also true that architectural theorists and historians were most interested in the formal consequences of Sullivan's theory and practice, and were therefore often willing to overlook what Sullivan actually thought about the function of tall office buildings. Sullivan assumes that architects have an obligation to express internal function on the visible surfaces of their buildings. The idea that internal functions are expressed in the visible form of natural things, even if relevant to the creation of architecture, has no rational or evidentiary basis. The most self-evident counterexample is the external form of the human body. The human brain, for example, has complex internal divisions that are associated with various functional capabilities. None of these functional zones have any external formal manifestations, the discredited speculations of phrenologists notwithstanding. We know about the function and location of internal human organs, not because they show up symbolically on the surface of the skin, but because people figured out how to cut open human bodies and look inside. None of this, however, has anything to do with the claim that these forms follow function. Both the internal content and external form of natural things obey their own laws, and however interrelated the former's behavior may be to the latter's form and appearance, this interrelationship has no bearing on the expressive qualities of one with respect to the other. Moreover, the obligation to express an object's internal structure on its surface cannot even be validated within Sullivan's own buildings, which represent only a small variation on the prevalent mode of expression that he found so abhorrent. In the examples shown here, neither Sullivan's or LeBaron Jennings' facade design is better or worse at expressing the functions occurring within. Both buildings provide a matrix of windows that provide light, air, and views for the variable occupancies contained within the buildings. Both buildings have gratuitous decorative elements on their facades that draw upon the subjective aesthetic frameworks valued by their architects. And in the continuing evolution of the tall office building, expression has remained stubbornly independent of the skyscraper's internal function. Sullivan's discussion of form and function can be seen as a rather self-serving and simplified variation on Gottfried Semper's more complex formulation, in that Sullivan's claim to have solved the artistic problem of the tall building contradicts Semper's understanding of stylistic development as a long cultural process rather than an individual act of genius. While Sullivan's notion of proper formal expression based on a tripartite division of the office building functions abstracts from the multiplicity of factors at work, not the least of which is the pleasure humans take in transcending basic forms that correspond to simple notions of function. Sullivan's analysis of the office building's tripartite vertical divisions is not a functional analysis in any true sense, since the actual functioning of such a building, determined by examining the relationships among office modules, elevator and stair shafts, access corridors, mechanical and electrical equipment, and their various needs for light and air, windows, light shafts, and courtyards, is not discussed and was not, in fact, what Sullivan was asked to consider when hired by Adler to design facades and ornamentation. Sullivan does point to relationships among office size, window, and structural bay, writing that the practical horizontal and vertical division, or office unit, is naturally based on a room of comfortable area and height. And the size of this standard office room as naturally predetermines the standard structural unit and approximately the size of window openings. But nothing about other functional interrelationships is mentioned. In fact, the conventional functional relationships within Sullivan's typical office floor plan in his old stock exchange building are virtually identical to those in William LeBaron Jennings' earlier wedding cake home insurance company building. Rather, like Karl Bodecher, the German archaeologist whose writings about architecture influenced Semper, he is more interested in developing an expressive art form to both hide and give meaning to the underlying functional core form, a core form that he denigrates as the materialistic product of the speculator, the engineer, the builder. The problem for Sullivan is to package this core form, this sterile pile, this crude, harsh, brutal agglomeration, this stark, staring exclamation of eternal strife, i.e., to package the actual functional elements of the building in a skin that can express the graciousness of those higher forms of sensibility and culture. The solution Sullivan arrives at, in opposition to what he considers obnoxious and abhorrent conventional office building design, where, for example, a 16-story building is expressed as 16 separate, distinct, and unrelated buildings piled one upon the other until the top of the pile is reached, is to make the building appear tall, without a single dissenting line. Thus, the problem with Sullivan's formulation about form following function is not that it isn't true. It is, in fact, often true for buildings, but that, on the one hand, its argument on the basis of biological and inorganic analogies is flawed, and, on the other hand, it abstracts from many of the functions that actually influence architectural form. Most architectural functions, for Sullivan, are not worthy of the architect's intellectual attention, both because they are the routine product of the speculator, the engineer, the builder, and because they are crude and materialistic. Instead, one small aspect of functionality, in this case, the tripartite functional division of an office building, is singled out because it supports Sullivan's argument that tall buildings should look, well, like Sullivan wants them to look.